Everyone, good morning. Thanks for coming. My name's Mike Light. I teach U.S. history in the social science department, and this morning's event is part of our annual conference celebrating Black History Month. We titled this the Race Ethnicity Conference. We've tried this year to continue in a proud tradition of allowing for outside speakers to come into GRCC and to present some of their research and some of their knowledge with our students, but also to give our own faculty a forum for sharing their interests and their research with all of you. And one of the hallmarks, and this may not mean much to you, but it means a great deal to us, one of the hallmarks that our department tries to shoot for is to have some interdisciplinary topics and focus in terms of some of the events that take place, and this morning is just that. So we're very proud to have 4 members of the biology department today who are going to be talking about not a trace of race, biologically speaking, how science refutes the myth of race. And I want to introduce them really quickly. I know you all have a homework assignment or an assignment that you were given right when you walked in the door. You probably didn't think you'd be working that hard today. My class didn't anyway. But I'm going to just give you a little bit of an idea of who these folks are, and then we'll move ahead, and I'll let them take over the show. First, on my right, your left, is Professor Sarah Krajewski. She's an associate professor in the biology department, where she's been involved in redesigning, implementing, and teaching Biology 101 and biology for elementary educators. She has a Master of Arts degree from Western Michigan, and she's currently completing a PhD in science education, also at Western? Yeah. All right. Her research explores the effective instructional practices for developing conceptual knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge of the nature of science within science classrooms. This research has implications on learning theories, science student retention, and best practiced pedagogy, and has led her to be an advocate for incorporating active learning strategies into traditional science lecture courses. On my far right, your far left, Dr. Matt Douglas, professor of zoology in the biological department here at GRCC. He's also a senior research scientist for the University of Kansas and an adjunct professor in the Department of Entomology at MSU. He received his PhD from the University of Kansas in evolutionary biology and biophysical ecology. That's a mouthful. He has been the recipient of a National Science Foundation grant. He publishes extensively in professional journals such as Science, Science Digest, and the Audubon. And he has authored several books, including The Butterflies of the Great Lakes Region, Introduction to Animal Behavior, and he's currently co-authoring an Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology textbook. He's also appeared on NPR, BBC, and national TV. He's a rock star. All right, Professor Tim Hoving, to Dr. Douglas's left, is an assistant professor in the biology department at GRCC and has been teaching here for 10 years. That 10 years ago is when they hired the best people. That's my time, too. His primary teaching interest is general biology for non-majors. He has a Bachelor of Science degree from MSU and a master's degree from East Carolina University. And then to his left, Professor Laurie Foster from the biology department here at GRCC has a master's degree from MSU. Her areas of teaching include anatomy and physiology and general biology for non-science majors, and her emphasis work is in promoting the advancement of science education. She is a recipient of the Biology Teacher of the Year Award by the Michigan Science Teachers Association, making her a rock star as well. The Excellence in Education Award from GRCC, an award bestowed on her by her colleagues. And she's been acknowledged as instrumental in helping GRCC achieve the notoriety of Phi Theta Kappa's National Honorary Award for Professional Teacher Education. And then I think that wraps up the introductions, right? I'm going to turn it over to the panel and let them take over.
Okay. All right, so Matt's going to speak first. So I got to make sure I'm not yelling into this. Matt's going to speak first, but first we're going to set it up with a clip from a PBS program that aired a few years back on cracking the code of life. So this whole documentary was about sequencing of the human genome that maybe some of you guys remember in the news, essentially looking at the whole molecular basis of humans, right? Looking at our DNA. And in this particular clip, what they've been talking about is that they sequenced the human genome from a couple people that live in Buffalo. And so the question is, could these people from Buffalo stand in for all of humanity, right? I mean, can you just pick one random person off the earth and say that their genome represents everybody's genome on Earth? And so we'll show you this little 2-minute clip. It's kind of interesting to set it up, and then Matt will take it away, okay? If this works, cross your fingers. So. Uh-oh, we got that problem again, don't we? Nervous laughter on my behalf there. So it's worth it. So we'll try to get this, this DVD likes to time out and cause problems. Nobody minds reading the FBI warning for a minute while we get this set up?
Do you know whether you are one of the winners?
I have a pretty good idea, yes, but I can't disclose that because it doesn't matter.
Well, if you're the head of the company and you're watching the decoding of moi, that has a little Miss Piggy quality to it.
Well, any scientist that I know would love to be looking at their own genetic code. I mean, how could you not want to and work in this field?
Well, I don't know. I don't work in this field. But I do wonder, could any small group, and could that guy from Buffalo, could he really be a stand-in for all humankind? Hasn't it been drummed into us since birth that we're all different, each and every one of us completely unique? We certainly look different. People come in so many shapes and colors and sizes. The DNA of these humans has got to be significantly different from the DNA of this human, right?
The genetic difference between any two people, 0.1%. Those two and any two people on this planet are 99.9% identical at the DNA level. It's only 1 letter in 1,000 difference.
And if I were to bring secretly into another room a black man, an Asian man, and a white man, and show you only their genetic code, could you tell which one was the white?
Not. What's going on? Well, it tells us that first, as a species, we are very, very closely related, because any two humans being 99.9% identical means that we're much more closely related than any two chimpanzees in Africa.
Wait. You mean if two chimpanzees are swinging through the forest, and you look at the genes of chimp A and the genes of chimp B...
Average difference between those chimps is 4 or 5 times more than the average difference between two humans that you would pluck off this planet.
Because we're such a young species?
That's right. See, the thing is, we are the descendants of a very small founding population. Every human on this planet goes back to a founding population of perhaps 10 or 20,000 people in Africa about 100,000 years ago. That little population didn't have a great deal of genetic variation, and what happened was it was successful, it multiplied all over the world, but in that time, relatively little new genetic variation has built up. And so we have today on our planet about the same genetic variation that we walked out of Africa with.
So people
We're going to start there, and I'm going to go into some of the biological information and how we actually measure those differences. So I'm going to try to make it fairly superficial so that we get the message. But some things will be a little deeper than others. And I'm going to show you a lot of trees of life, because when I was growing up, we had one tree. It looked like an oak tree. And now we have all these so-called dendrograms, which are, based on statistical analysis of gene frequency, or one gene, or changes in a nucleotide sequence. There's all sorts of things that we actually measure them with. Can I get started?
Once again. Issues? Yep, issues. So, I don't know, class or someone.
Well, while we're waiting, I'll keep talking because that's what I do best. Oh, good. Okay. So, do you want me to review these slides? Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk about the evolution and migration of humanity out of Africa. Because all the evidence, as you will see, points to the fact that we are a relatively new species on the block, maybe less than 100,000 years. That doesn't give us a lot of generational time to build up a lot of difference. And all the evidence we have from any source of DNA points to the fact that this is where we came from. All the paleontological evidence points to the same region. And all the evidence that has to do with certain kinds of DNA that's found in our organelles says the same thing. So we're going to look at that first. All right, now, you don't have to know anything about this except two things. First of all, these are domains. Now, when you were in high school, maybe you didn't have domains, but these are even above the level of kingdom. So we have a domain here called bacteria, the true bacteria. We have a domain called eukarya. These have true nuclei with DNA inside the nucleus. And over here we have archaea, which are another bacteria-like group that we're going to ignore for right now. These are the so-called extremophiles. They live in crazy environments like caves or 3 miles down under the Earth's surface. But over here, right here, if you look carefully, it says proteobacteria. Well, those proteobacteria have a circular loop of DNA. Sometimes there's many copies of that loop. And they are closely related to an organelle in our body called the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondrion is the so-called powerhouse of the cell. Its major responsibilities in all the eukaryotic cells are to make ATP, the energy source of all our biochemical reactions. Now, we have up here, you are here. You guys are animals, right? Most of you? Okay. Well, it looks like over the course of evolution, some of these bacteria related to rickettsia. Now, rickettsia are not nice things these days. Rickettsia are obligate parasites. They live inside your cells, and they cause wonderful diseases like Rocky Mountain spotted fever and murine typhus and other types of typhus. But they are closely related to what is in our cells called mitochondria. So the genes are very, very similar. We know now that they are more than likely captured organelles. So we can actually trace the evolution of animals and all these other groups here by looking at the mitochondria. Notice also that we're not too far away from slime molds, right? And fungi over here, and plants. I mean, we're all kind of kissing cousins right here. So this tree has changed tremendously, and this is a very simple tree. It's called a rooted tree because we're looking at ribosomal RNA, which is another organelle that's in our bodies here. We're going to go to the next slide here. So we're classified in that group of animals as primates. So you might want to know what a primate is. And first of all, we have a well-developed clavicle. If you reach back here, you can find a good clavicle. Some of our relatives have clavicles that are more like this. We're kind of flattened this way, right? Monkeys are a little more barrel-chested, you know, and the gait's a little different. But we have a high degree of mobility because if we didn't, I wouldn't be able to do these sun salutes with yoga and all sorts of other things. And most chimpanzees don't do that. At least they don't like to do that. We have 5 digits. Now, there are exceptions, but typically we have 5. And most of our claws are now these hard keratinized nails. So we have flatbed nails on most primates. These are just things that are morphological that put us in this group. We have tactile pads. Our dermis makes these little bumps, these little papilla underneath, and we have these fingerprint pads. A lot of primates have these, mostly the great apes. We have a tendency towards a reduced snout, meaning that we're not kind of drawn out like this, like a rat. We're more, everything's kind of behind the nose here, behind the eye orbits. We have these bunodont molars. We have these ridges on our molars, usually 5. One's poorly developed, but the other 4 are pretty good size, and that kind of categorizes too, because you know sometimes when you're looking for fossils, the only thing you have left are teeth. So a person who's really knowledgeable on structures and enamel deposition on teeth can figure out diets of organisms and all sorts of other information. You just can't believe what they can do with these teeth. We have good binocular vision, and our vision is color vision. That is not true for all animals, but our group is very well attuned. You can tell a ripe fruit in a tree from a fruit that is not ripe, and that's very, very important to selection, as we will see. We have a very large brain. We have a huge cerebral cortex, enormous, bigger than any other group. And we have a tendency to hold our trunk upright. So this is our trunk here. I'm holding it upright, right? Now, at my age, it begins to kind of sag a bit, and the bones start to grind together, the discs start to go. It's kind of a secondary position, but I saw a little thing, I think it was on the PBS channel. They were showing gibbons in Africa, and they were standing up looking for enemies, and they're standing up there looking around, and then when they saw the enemy, they quickly dashed over the cliff there for protection. So we call that facultative bipedalism, which means that we can walk on two legs pretty well. Now, chimps can do this, gorillas can do this, orangutans can do this, but they don't do it like we do. We can run. Chimps can't run very well. Even bonobos, those fancy chimps, can't do very well in a race with us. So here's another kind of tree. This is the kind of tree you might have expected in high school. Over here, you can see that the primates are really an old group. They go back before the extinction of the dinosaurs. That's 65 million years ago. And then we have a branch up here, which goes up to the earliest types of primates. These are lemurs and lorises. Lemurs are located on Madagascar now. Then we have another group called tarsiers over here, and two other groups, the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys. The New Worlds mostly have a prehensile tail, which means they can grab onto a branch with their tail. None of these has that. And we don't either. In fact, we don't even have a tail. So we're looking at one small group here, the gorillas, the orangutans, the chimpanzees, and humans, and we put them all in a family called Hominidae. So we are called hominins under the newest nomenclature, hominins. All right, well, here's another tree, see? Lots of trees. But, the basic information here is we're looking at genetic differences, as Tim was pointing out, and up here, these are pongo, these are orangutans up here, gibbons, gorillas, Neanderthals, sometimes it's spelled with just a T now, but Neanderthals, and here's humanity right there. So you can see just by looking at this part of the tree, we are very closely related to Neanderthals. But their genetic difference is significant, so therefore we put them in a distinct species. And down here are the various chimpanzees. Here's the bonobos right here. These are the other two, perhaps three species of chimpanzees. But looking at all these together, you can all see that right there at the node, these suggest a common ancestor. Now, do we know what that ancestor looked like? Probably not, because the fossil record, as you know, is very incomplete. So here's another dendrogram, another tree. We can look at this tree here. I just want you to look at the basic names here. The biggest names right now in all of evolution of humanity have to do with Ardipithecus ramidus, which is the big one now. It's been in a lot of the magazines. Science devoted half an issue to it in October. That used to be named when I was growing up, when I was taking an anthropology course at Michigan, this would have been Australopithecus. Just to give you a heads up, they change names, okay? So the names that you see up here now may not be the same names 10 years from now. So the test question may be the same, but the answer may be different, all right? So over here we have another group. It's now called Paranthropus. That was also called Australopithecus or Australopithecus when I was growing up. And then right here you can see, if you look at this timeline, you see this right there? Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, the handyman, and Australopithecus africanus. And then over here we have Paranthropus. So all these were living in East Africa at the same time. In other words, this is not a linear progression. You don't have this species giving rise to this species. It's not like a chain of events. This is a bush that we had in Africa. And we will see that the most extensive diversity of DNA of all sorts is found in Africa, and the rest of us are kind of clones of certain parts of African DNA. So up here, let's see, up here, we have Homo erectus, a distinct species. Homo ergaster apparently was one of the groups that might have led to this species over here. Homo heidelbergensis over here, Homo sapiens, and Homo neanderthalensis. There's one more that's been added to that, and I'll show that to you in just a second here. 30,000 years ago, there wasn't just us out there. There's 4 distinct species of humans, and we give them the name Homo erectus, the erect man, Homo neanderthalensis, which is the man from the Neanderthal Valley in Germany, Homo floresiensis, which is a new hobbit-type human from the Isle of Flores in Indonesia, a really cute little thing, 3 feet tall. May have been a type of erectus. We don't know. They haven't put it in a place yet. And finally, Homo sapiens looks like a fairly diverse species, but as we've seen, genetically, we're kind of almost clonal. We're almost Very, very similar, very new species. So all of these were humans, and all of these were alive just 18,000 years ago. 30,000 years ago is the earliest estimate. Now, these are skulls of those different groups. And I forgot the names of the skulls. Anybody know the names of the skulls? I washed my hand this morning, so I don't have any names in my hand either. So I really apologize, but you know, I'll do the best I can, okay? We have up here living chimps. Okay, we have Australopithecus or Australopithecus. We have Homo habilis. And down here we have more ancient homos that led to Homo erectus over here. And another string ergasters and Heidelbergensis. Over here we have Neanderthals. And over here we have Cro-Magnon, which is a modern species of human. And finally, us. Now, if you look at these skulls, you think, well, how do you tell them apart? You know, I think if you looked at them at first, you'd say, well, okay, I see that at least in profile, these tend to stick out more. The canines are much bigger in this group. The canines are generally speaking lost and get much smaller as we go through this group over here. The skull is changing in shape so that rather than the elongated small skull of maybe 400 cc's, about the size of a grapefruit, we have a pretty good sized skull now and a pretty good brain. And look at this brain over here. I mean, it's huge, right? Neanderthals weren't much different in brain size, but they were kind of a stockier, bigger group of people. So when you look at skulls, this is the information that we want, because looking at skulls can tell you bone structure, it can tell you tooth structure, it can tell you whether you were an aggressive homo, or it can tell you whether you were vegetarian. There's all sorts of things that you can pick out. Some of these walked upright all the time, and others did not. They were facultative, and they were clumsy walkers. So, humans evolved from within the apes. This we know. We are apes. We have no tail, but all the other things that we have are shared with the great apes. And by that, I mean orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. So over here, we have uniquely derived traits such as large brains, no tail, erect posture, greater flexibility of the hips. You know, we can do this kind of stuff, and others can't do that. Flexibility of the wrist, that varies quite a bit. The one that they just found in Flores, the island of Flores, didn't have the kind of wrist that we have. It was much more stable, so we don't know exactly what they could do as far as manipulation. Because remember, it's fine motor control, right? Isn't that what parents always get excited about? The first time the baby puts food in the mouth and it doesn't go in the face? That's fine motor control. It takes a long time to develop. So we have changes in the structure of the shoulder and the arm sockets and the legs as well. We walk a little bit knock-kneed, most of us. We're kind of like this. Femurs come out and go down like that. Whereas, you know, if you look at chimps and bonobos are a little bit more like this. And bonobos, though, can walk for a long time bipedally. The only problem is bonobos like to make love all the time, so we can't put them in the zoos because that would be bad, right? Now, what's the molecular evidence? Well, we can make those trees I was showing you. We can make species trees. We can make gene trees. We have 23,000 some genes that code for proteins. And we can make trees, species trees, out of one gene, or we can make species trees out of multiple genes. The best thing is to use many independent genes and different chromosomes, right? The more data you can get, the better. Now, what is the difference between using DNA from any source or using morphology? Well, you're looking at two different things, right? But one codes for the other. The DNA codes for the morphology. So if you develop a tree using DNA and it looks like this, like the palm of my hand, and I develop another tree using morphological traits like skull size, teeth size, and it looks like this, and I put them together, I would say they're congruent, right? They agree with one another. And all the trees that we develop virtually, with minor exceptions, agree that we came out of Africa, that we're a relatively new species, and that we are monophyletic. So that word right here is the only word you got to know today. A clade is a branch. A cladogram is a picture of the branching sequence of evolution. So if you want to be monophyletic, which is what you want when you make a branch, you want to include your immediate ancestors as well as all the descendants of that ancestor. So if you give an analogy of a family, you have two biological parents. Now, you may not know one of them, but you do have that, right, everybody? Okay, we're good with that. And then you have descendants Well, if you leave some of those descendants out, like some of your siblings because you don't like them out of your tree, that's not a good tree, is it? Or maybe you're feeling very generous and you want to put people who look kind of like you in the same tree. You can't do that either because they don't share common ancestry, right? You want a tree where the ancestors the ancestors give rise to certain species in the end. So monophyly means you have one branch. That's all it means, monophyly. Now, we can use molecular clocks. We know that DNA does not stay the same. It changes over time. We have substitutions in some of these base pairs. They're called AT, CG, and we have 3 billion of them. So in modern humans, we have like 35 million base pair substitutions that are pretty common. Well, that's a drop in the bucket, right? That's what he was talking about, less than 1/10 of 1% difference between all the humanity on Earth. That is not very big. Well, judging from these clocks, from using living animals today, including ourselves, gorillas diverge, about 6.4 million years ago. So gorillas are off on a branch like this. Humans and chimpanzees are coming off on a branch like this. So we have chimpanzees and humans diverge after that, 5.4 million years ago. Some of the fossils that we have here go back that far. Now, what's the difference then between humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas? Well, gorillas and chimpanzees have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23. What's happened? Well, here's what's happened. The human chromosome number 2 results from a fusion of, I'm going to call it 2A and 2B. So the genes on those chromosomes are the same, it's just that it's been split. Now, we don't know if it's been split or if there's been a fusion. We don't have any evidence for that one way or the other, but that explains the differences between these things. The genes are the same, they're just on what we would call 2 chromosomes now. Now, in the coding genes, chimpanzees and humans differ at only 1.1% of synonymous nucleotides. So when you're looking at this sequence of nucleotides and DNA, no matter what it's from, the synonyms, that is, the ones that are the same, there's variation only in about 1%. That is very, very tiny. About 95% of the nucleotide base pairs are the same between humans and chimps. So that is extraordinary. And yet we differ for at least 5.5 million years. It's been a long time since we shared DNA with them. So we want to look at genetic differences across the whole genome, all the chromosomes, and that's difficult to do. We've just sequenced some things with Neanderthals and humans and chimps, and we're getting closer and closer to have a very good genetic tree. Now, the fossil evidence, everyone complains about the fossil evidence. Well, and they should, because if you want to be a good fossil, you got to die in the right place. And most of us don't do that, right? You have to die when a volcanic eruption occurs and you get buried with volcanic ash for 3 feet. That's a good way to die and be a fossil. Or, as I tell my zoology students, you should die near a stream where there's flash floods and you get covered with silt. I mean, you got to think ahead if you want to be a fossil. Most of these guys didn't do that. So finding anything after 5 million years is a breath of fresh air. It's wonderful. So Ardipithecus, the one they just recently discovered that goes back 4.4 million years, they know at least that the toes, the big toes, splay out to the side like this, and they can still walk on branches and hang on like this, but they were also bipedal. And that makes your brain get a little bigger, your eyes a little better. All these things as suites of traits happen along with them. So we're looking at the last common ancestor of these things. We think that they had culture. Chimps have culture. Chimps can break rocks. They can pass this on to their offspring. They can take sticks and sharpen them and poke in there for termites and mounds. They can do all sorts of things. Some chimps act on the level of maybe a 3 to 4-year-old. They can figure things out. They're not stupid. And they can look at you and go, I wish you'd get out of my sight here because I want to enjoy my place at the zoo. We have good chimps at the John Ball Zoo here in town, but we don't have bonobos. They act kind of like us, So the major evidence here is for these genera, Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, and Homo. If you just key in on those things, we're pretty good. Here's our tree, right? Remember, it's morphology, morphology, morphology if you're looking for fossils. If you're going to make a DNA tree, you're going to look at living things and compare the current DNA that's in those species. But this, you can't dig up DNA for most of these things. It's too old. DNA tends to degrade after 100,000 years, and it's hard to get. So right here, we have these ancient ancestors here, and huge gaps, true, in the fossil record. Here's Ardipithecus, an amazing new fossil. Anamensis over here. Now, these are all Australopithecines, actually. This group is now in Paranthropus, so this is a little older tree. And over here we have the genus Homo. But look, we're looking at 2.5 million years ago, and we have a tool culture called Oldovan from the Olduvai Gorge. And that is shared by the ancestral versions of what will become chimpanzees and humans. So the African replacement model, it best explains the DNA and the morphology. That is that we came out of Africa. The greatest diversity of all DNA is found in Africa. It's huge numbers of diversity, as Tim will point out later on. And the genetic difference among living humans is far less than that between living chimpanzees. There's a lot of variation between chimpanzees, and they live pretty close together. They're not like us. But we are a highly movable species. We say we're highly vagile. We move like crazy, right? Even now, the wars that are started are mostly over resources and, thoughts and things like that. You got to go out and conquer, but that's a very ancient thing. And chimpanzees as well. Now, bonobos don't really care because all they want to do is make love, right? But the other chimpanzees are much more aggressive. So genetic differences do exist among humans, but it's very small. And you have to find an extraordinary program, because these are all computerized programs now, in order to figure things out. Now, going back to the mitochondria of the rickettsia-like organism, these are passed down by your mothers only. So all your mitochondria here are from mom. So if you look at the variation in all your mitochondrial DNA, you can kind of work it down and find out what we call the mitochondrial Eve. Now, that means a population of proto-humans or whatever. It doesn't mean one individual. She had to share DNA with others of her group, of course. She didn't pop out of a toaster. But we have divergence of Neanderthals and modern humans about 500,000 years ago. And our mitochondrial Eve, well, about 120,000 years ago to maybe 200,000 years ago. And the reason for that variation is we can't always pinpoint things exactly, because the mutation rate varies between different parts of the chromosome. So we walk and run bipedal. We have large brains. We have complex tools. It's not like we're chimps, right? You guys are going to pass your calculus test maybe today, or maybe zoology test on Wednesday. Chimps can't do that, okay? They can't do yoga real well. They don't take instructions for ballet real well. So we are way ahead of that. I'm not saying that there's no difference. I'm saying that ancestrally we belong, okay? These are the oldest tools right here, the Oldowan tools from Ethiopia. Genus Homo, or maybe Paranthropus. We don't know. It could be both. They could have been sharing ideas. We have no idea. Our thumb. I mean, look at your thumb. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Chimps can't always twist and angle their thumbs like this. We can. And we have 3 little muscles in there that make us much more able to do this kind of stuff. That's huge. Doesn't look like it, but it's huge. We have a larynx that's descended down. So the larynx has these muscles that attach to the tongue, and those are very important because this is our only freely suspended bone in the whole body. And we think Neanderthals had a freely suspended, hyoid bone like this too. So the larynx descends as children, which gives them all kinds of choking problems. If you've had kids, you know that you can't feed them too fast, right? Well, taking all this together, you can actually find markers on the Y chromosome, which is inherited only by the males. And these markers have these names like LLY22, M173. Well, you can see here easily that here is the origin of all these things, right there where we find all the fossil humans and we find the greatest diversity of hominids today. And you can see the migratory paths go way over here. You can actually trace this stuff. It's really cool. And if you show pictures of people who live over here, say in South Africa, to people who might be over here in the Americas or over here, they will resemble one another. It's kind of frightening. Skin color doesn't matter as far as this is concerned. You show them a picture and they say, oh, God, that looks like Uncle Ed, and you might be a Navajo. And you're talking about the San people of South Africa. So it's really kind of interesting. All right, now, just to wrap up here, migration of human out of Africa. We have a mitochondrial Eve we can talk about. We can talk about an African Adam, if you will. But all the evidence, morphology, the skulls, the bones, the fossils, and all the DNA points to the fact that we are all Africans, that we have come out of here relatively recently. We've populated the earth in crazy ways. And now the next question is, do we have subspecies or so-called races, right? Do we really have those? Are we too new? And Tim's going to take over, right?
So who wants to summarize all that? Nobody? No takers? I think I've learned two things. That one, you can't count on technology, right? And two, science is hard. Right? How many people are thinking, this is why I didn't go into science, all those terms, right? I mean, that's confusing, right? I wonder why I went into it after I watched that. So anyway, this question. So Matt kind of showed you that that humans are this recently evolved species, right? Came out of Africa, and you saw in that little video, they estimate maybe around 70 to 100,000 years ago, right? And we have a remarkable amount of genetic similarity. As they said in there, you pluck any two humans off the earth, right? There's only going to be 0.1% difference between anyone. But the chimps hanging around in Africa, they could be 3, 4, 5 times more different than each other. So, but that doesn't seem to make sense when we look at each other, does it? When you did that little activity, when you just look around this room, it looks like we have some pretty big differences between each other, right? And because we're kind of basing these on superficial features like skin color, right, or hair texture or color, or nose shape, or things like that. So we're going to address this question then. After these humans migrated out of Africa, have they become kind of separate from each other over time, right? Have we evolved into different races, different, genetically different groups of people? So that's what we're going to look at. So the question is, does race exist in a biological sense? Another way of thinking about this is you fill out a census form, right? And they're doing a census this year, right? They do it every decade. So I think they're promoting it in commercials right now. And you have to check off, right? I'm white, or I'm black, or American Indian, or whatever the options are on the census form. Does that indicate that if you identify with a so-called race in the census form, that you're more genetically similar to all the people of that race than you are to people of other races, right? Is there something biological to that makes you different than members of another race? So we'll look at that. First, we have to actually ask and then answer this question of what is a biological race? And it's probably going to be a little bit different than what you think of race being. Okay? In biology, race has kind of a specific meaning. It's interchangeable with the term subspecies. And so here's the definition here. Populations of a single species that have diverged from each other. That's what a biological race is. And I'm showing you owls here. So if you look at that map, you can see that there are three races of spotted owls, right? The species is spotted owls, but there are 3 races or subspecies living in Western North America. So you have the northern race, the California race, and the Mexican race. Maybe you remember these things. Some of you guys are too young, but there was controversy over whether we should cut down old-growth forests in the Northwest to protect the spotted owl. And so these 3 races of spotted owls are reproductively isolated from each other, which means that because they differ from each other in their geographic location, they tend to really not have the ability to intermix with each other. Okay? So this Mexican race doesn't ever go over and breed with the California race or the northern race and vice versa between all 3 of them. So they have been sort of isolated from each other because of geography, right? Now, they could if one could fly to the other area, they could reproduce and have offspring, and that makes them the same species, but they really don't do that, right? In reality, they stay separate from each other. So we call them different races, right? It means that this group came from a different ancestor than that one, and they've kind of stayed isolated from each other. Because of this isolation over time, their gene pools have become different. And this is an important thing that we'll address and see whether we can see this in like owls and then the same type of thing in humans. So if you were going to look at the genes of the Mexican race versus the California race, you might find specific genes in that Mexican race that you wouldn't in the California race, because those genes have kind of popped up, right, through random mutation and been a part of that population, but since they don't interbreed with each other, they haven't spread between the races. The other thing, too, is the environments are different in these places. So the Mexican race might have evolved different traits over time in response to those differences in environments that you don't see between these other races, okay? So let's see then, does that apply to humans, right? This race definition that we can apply to the owls, can we apply this to humans? When you look at these 6 people, they look different from each other, right? Everybody agree they're the same species? Yeah? Once again, the definition of a species in biology is they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Right? I think intuitively you probably know they can all reproduce and produce fertile offspring, right? Although you don't know those people, but I'm sure they probably could. But the thing is, they have different skin colors, right? And we might categorize them in different races. Does that mean that this person is from a group of people that maybe evolved in Europe and didn't intermix with these people, right, and came from a separate ancestor and stayed separate over time, like with the owls, or not, right? That's what we're going to try to think about. So we can answer this question by actually analyzing the gene pools of the different races. And I'll talk about specifically what we're going to do with that in a second. First, though, I have to address this question. So 2 terms up here that I'm going to use, and hopefully everybody's kind of heard of some of these, at least the first one. I'm sure everybody's heard of the term genes before, right? Maybe not the second one. Anybody know how to pronounce that one? Alleles? Some of you guys might be in zoology class. You're cheating. You've already had it. You've heard. So genes then are segments of DNA that code for traits, right? In this little diagram here, you can see here's a cell, right? In the nucleus of cells are these little things called chromosomes. As Matt mentioned, we have 46. Humans have 46 chromosomes in our cells. And scattered around on those 46 chromosomes are these genes. They estimate now there's about 25,000 genes, right? 25,000 individual little parts of that DNA that code for information, right? There's a gene that might code for your eye color, or maybe several genes that code for how your eyes look, right? Or several genes that code for your skin color and so on. Then the term allele, what that means is the alternate versions of that gene, okay? So maybe there's a gene that codes for skin color. Well, the alternate versions could be light skin or dark skin, right? Or maybe there's a gene for hair color. You could have a brown hair allele or a blonde hair allele, these different versions of the gene. What are the 4 human blood types? Anybody want to answer that question? Okay, I heard it from a variety of people. You have A, B, it's just like my class. When I ask that question, it's just some mumbling, a few people answer. So A, B, and O, right? Well, there are 3 blood type alleles. There are 3 versions of the blood type gene, A, B, and O, right? And those intermix in different ways to determine what your blood type is then, okay? So alleles are the alternate versions of the gene. That's important to remember. All right, so back to this question we had on this page. Do human races represent true biological races? And we're going to analyze a couple things in the gene pools of races. The 2 things, if humans truly are separate races, separate biological entities, we should find some race-specific alleles, right? If the white race went up to Europe and evolved separately from the other races, there should have been some gene that popped up over time that you find in white people that you wouldn't find in the other races, right? And the other thing is differences in allele frequencies. Once again, let's say Asian people have been separate from the other races over time, right? Over time, their DNA would have changed in response to their environment. They would have kind of gone down their own evolutionary pathway different from the other races if they were truly isolated, right? If they were truly their own biological race. So we're going to look for those 2 things in the data. So the first question, do we find any race-specific alleles? Any guesses to what the answer is? No, right? Now, I could give you some evidence to support that, right? It's not good enough just to say no. So one example here, sickle cell anemia. What type of people, what group of people do you commonly associate sickle cell anemia with? Okay, maybe African Americans, right? Or you might think people with dark skin, right? Maybe you think that that's where you'll find sickle cell, the sickle cell allele more often. If you look at this map, you can see where the sickle cell allele exists around the world. Now, it does exist in parts of Africa where people have dark skin, of course, right? But people living down here have dark skin too, and you don't find the sickle cell allele there. People living here have dark skin, you don't find it. These people over here definitely don't look the same as Africans in terms of skin color, but you do find the sickle cell allele. And you can't even see it on this map, but there's a population of people living in Greece that have a high frequency of sickle cell anemia. Any guess as to what sickle cell allele, the sickle cell allele is associated with? Where do you find it, or why do you find it in these areas? It doesn't have anything to do with blood type, actually. Yeah, Mike knows. You're cheating. He's an instructor, though. He can't answer. The answer is wherever malaria exists, sickle cell anemia is going to exist. Okay, so this next map shows you a little overlap. You can see the overlap of the sickle cell allele and malaria, right? They pretty well correlate to each other. It's an interesting thing. If you have 1 copy of the sickle cell allele, then you're resistant to malaria, right? And malaria is serious. Malaria kills 1 million people every year. They estimate it's killed more people in the history of the world than any other infectious disease. So it'd be a good thing to have resistance to that, right? If you live where malaria is. And so having 1 copy of that sickle cell allele gives you that resistance, and you have a better chance of surviving than if you don't carry that allele, right? If you don't carry it, you might die from malaria. So you find that association. Now, 2 copies of the sickle cell allele is no good. Then you have full-blown sickle cell anemia, right? And you'll probably end up dying from that. But that gene is maintained in those populations because it does give you resistance to this more dangerous disease, malaria, right, where that exists. So what we think of as maybe being a black person's disease or an African American disease is not true at all, right? This gene is not specific to that so-called race. It's found in a variety of races, okay? So you could apply this, I could go on and on with different examples. Scientists haven't found or identified a single allele, right? A single version of a gene that's found in all or even most populations of a race and not found in others. So let's say the black race exists on this continent, right? Do all the people there have sickle cell anemia? Do all the different populations? They don't, right? Do you find this allele in other populations around the world in other races? You do, right? It doesn't matter what gene you picked out, you'd find the same thing. Even something interestingly enough like skin color, right? Maybe you think that in Africa all the people have the allele for dark skin. Well, it turns out skin color is determined by multiple genes. There could be 3, 4, 5, who knows how many genes that actually determine your skin color, right? The reason Laurie's skin is white and my skin is white could be from completely different alleles, right? So all white people in this room don't necessarily carry the same white gene. It could be 5 different genes that make you white, and we might not have the same ones. So if you analyze that in Europe, you wouldn't find consistency there, and you might find those same genes scattered around the world, and even people that have dark skin. So we don't find race-specific alleles. So the answer no, right? The second question, are there differences in allele frequencies between races? Once again, that question of if groups are separate from each other and evolving down their own pathways, right? The Asian race is evolving down a different pathway than the white race. You're going to find these alleles, these versions of the genes in different amounts in those different areas. And so when you look for this, do you find any of these patterns developing? Once again, the answer is no. So this is kind of a complicated thing. And let me see if I can explain it. This is put myself to the test as a teacher. These are the frequencies of 3 different alleles, or types of genes that can exist. The actual genes isn't important. They're kind of complex, have crazy names. But the point is that these are 3 different types of alleles for different genes. Now, let's pick out this one right here. These people, Taiwanese, Japanese, and Bombay Indians, are all traditionally classified as Asians, right? If all Asians came from some common Asian ancestor, right, and were isolated in Asia and went down their own pathways, you'd expect the frequency of this gene to be about the same in all of those people, right? But it's not anywhere close, is it? Bombay Indians have this allele, and maybe 60 to 70% of them have it, right? Whereas the Taiwanese people, only maybe looks like 20 or 30% of the people have that particular allele. So there are no clear patterns that develop for any allele you might look at. A lot of times there's more differences within a race, right, than there are between races. This is something really interesting. It was serendipity. We was looking at Nature magazine laying in our resource room yesterday, and there's just a new study that came out. They sequenced the genomes of a population of people living in South Africa and found that 2 people that lived within walking distance from each other were more different from each other genetically than a European and an Asian would be, right? So you don't find necessarily consistent frequencies of genes within given populations, and especially not within an overall race, right? You can't look at this and say that Asian people are all the same as each other with respect to their genes, because there's wide differences, right? And it doesn't matter what gene you pick out and what race you pick out, you don't find patterns developing there. So there's often, like I said, more variability within races than between races, okay? And scientists have observed this pattern for every gene they've studied in humans. Matt kind of alluded to the point. In Africa, you find the most variation of any so-called race, right? Because those African populations have been around on Earth the longest, right? That's where the original Homo sapiens came from. They've kind of migrated around and inhabited different areas. And that time has allowed a lot of differences to develop between those groups, okay? So you could have let's say you had 10,000 people originally in Africa, right? Just making up numbers, right? And 500 of them wandered up into Europe and started a population that over time became light-skinned because that skin color is favored up there, right? And 500 wandered down into southern Africa, right? And they stayed dark-skinned because it was favored in that sunny environment. Are you going to say then that those people, the two populations, the original Ethiopian population in Africa and the ones that wandered away, are the same as each other because they both have dark skin and they're somehow vastly different than the people that wandered up into Europe and whose skin became light over time? We're looking at something like skin color and assuming that that tells us a lot about the species, or about, about the so-called race, but it doesn't necessarily. So we should find those two things genetically right if there are true biological races within people, and we don't find either of them, okay? So the conclusion is that human races are not biological races, okay? So that's what we can draw from the scientific evidence, that there isn't a true difference between the major races as we define them on Earth. And the reason is that we've never really been isolated from each other. As Matt said, people can wander around, right? Is there any place you could put somebody on Earth and really keep them isolated from the rest of the people, other than prison maybe, right? People can wander around and go where they want, and that's what we've been doing since we wandered out of Africa. We've been mixing together with each other. Essentially, we like to wander and we're promiscuous, right? We're interested in our neighbors. You know, you get to know them, and sooner or later you have a baby together, right? And so we're constantly mixing genes together. People from Europe migrating to Asia who might migrate down to Africa, and so on. So we've just been mixing together for too long, right, too consistently, for us to have become separate biological groups. Like you look at this map, the B blood type. How many of you guys in this room have blood type B? Or even AB? Most people don't know their blood types, do they? That's a crazy thing. But if you have blood type B, what that means, you could think, is that you have some Asian blood in you. Because if you look at maps of the frequency of this blood type B, it's most common like in Central Asia. That indicates that's where that gene first evolved, and it's spread out from there. You ask a German, you ask Hitler, right? Did you have any Asian blood in you? I bet his answer would have been no, right? But if anybody has blood type B in Europe, that means that sometime over the past, people have migrated from Asia into Europe and bred with them, right, and spread this allele around, okay? So you can find these patterns, or clines as they call them, of different alleles spreading around, right? Just strong evidence that we've been mixing together with each other, time immemorial. So we have really not been isolated long enough. Now, that's not to say that we don't have differences, right? Obviously, my skin color is different than other people in this room. My hair color, unfortunately, the amount of hair I have, right? A lot of these different things are different between each other. And so one reason for that is natural selection, right? This whole idea of what drives evolution. You look at these two people. Raise your hand if you'd put them in the same race. I mean, I think I probably would too, typically, right? That's just kind of common thing to look at. They're both dark-skinned. They come from the same race. But look at their nose shapes, right? Those are drastically different, right? What if we decided not to categorize people by skin color, but instead by nose shape? Well, then they'd be different races, right? And this person might be in the same race as a Norwegian, if you wanted to do it that way. So we look at one thing, typically, right? Skin color, maybe a few other traits too, and then kind of lump the races together like that. But that's not the only thing. It happens to be that having a long nose is good for living in a dry place because it kind of moistens the air that you breathe in and traps a lot of the dust, right, if you live in a desert environment. So we can look at these two people with the same skin color and typically say they're part of the same race, but their noses differ from each other because of natural selection, right? Yet, if you looked at a person that had white skin and that colored nose, you'd say that they're in different races, and that's due to the fact that they've been isolated from each other forever, right? But that's not true, okay? Another important thing is figuring out where skin color differences come from, right? So that still, I think it's hard to get away from this. I mean, this evidence about biology and race first started coming out in the early 70s. Scientists realized that the races as we define them are not biological, right? But 40 years later, it's still a strong belief that it's biological. It's hard to change your thinking on that. And the main thing is we look at each other and see the skin color differences and think there's got to be something fundamentally different about those people, right? But skin color is just one trait of thousands in people, and the way that's determined is really where you live on Earth. Not necessarily so much who your ancestors are going back thousands of years, right? It's determined more where you live on Earth. Now, of course, I'm white-skinned and somebody else in this room is dark-skinned because our parents were, right? You can trace your traits easily back one generation. But that doesn't mean that your ancestors thousands of years ago had the same color skin necessarily, right? And it's because they're all from some group of white people or some group of black people or so on. I'll try to explain this. This is going to be the confusing part again, right? So, don't worry about being tested on this because this is going to be complex. But there are two important vitamins in humans that have to do with giving birth, being reproductively successful, right? One's vitamin D. How do you get vitamin D? Sunlight, right? Or maybe eating a lot of fish or drinking milk too, right? So, but generally, if you spend time in the sun, you'll get vitamin D. That's important for women because then their pelvic bones develop nice and strong and they can give birth to healthy babies. And then folate. Anybody ever heard of taking folic acid, right? If you're pregnant or before you're trying to become pregnant, right? This is an important vitamin too. And if you don't have enough folate and you're a female, then your babies tend to not develop well and you don't give birth to many babies, right? So the way it works here is vitamin D is made by being exposed to sunlight, right? Folate is the opposite. Too much sunlight can break folate down in your body, right? Or ruin your ability to store folate. So what happens is you see that if you live in a low UV light area, like Norway, okay? Light skin is favored over dark skin. The problem is, with very little sunlight, if you have dark skin, you're not going to make much vitamin D, right? That dark skin's blocking that low sunlight that you're getting, and it's going to prevent you from having very, very many babies, right? So dark skin is not going to be favorable in that environment. And if you have dark skin, you're less likely to reproduce, and there's going to be less dark-skinned people then in that environment. If you have light skin, though, you're going to make enough vitamin D, and you're going to be more reproductively successful, right? You'll have more babies, and that gene for having light skin will get passed on more often, right? So light skin will become more frequent in that environment than dark skin. You have no problem with folate. There's not enough UV light to break down your folate regardless of skin color in that environment. But then let's say you live near the equator where there's lots of sunlight, right, all the time. Then light skin's a problem because you're going to have your folate problems, right? The folate isn't going to be stored right. You're not going to have many babies, so you're not going to be passing on these genes for light skin. But if you're dark-skinned, you're going to have adequate amounts of folate because that dark skin's kind of protecting you from that sunlight, that intense sunlight, and you're going to have more babies, okay? So I don't know if that made sense to everybody or not. You're probably somewhat drifting at this point. I've been in here for an hour, right? But the point is that different skin colors are favored in different environments. It doesn't mean people with dark skin have all evolved from dark ancestors, right? It just means over time that skin color is favored in that environment. Once again, Laurie's white skin and her ancestors could have been completely different than my white skin and my ancestors. Just light skin was favored in the environment of our ancestors, right? And it might be different genes too, right? It might be a different gene making her skin white and my skin white. So then two other things that strongly influence the differences between people. So that's one thing. That accounts for skin color. Natural selection accounts for nose shape, things like that. What are some of the other reasons? You look around the earth, different populations tend to really kind of look alike in certain areas, right? And nobody's suggesting that there aren't genetic differences between specific populations. Definitely a group of people that are isolated on an island in the Pacific and don't intermingle with other people that much probably do have more genetic differences between other people, right, than two people on their own island. But that's not to suggest that everybody in that race has all those same characteristics, okay? So sexual selection is one thing. Look at the crazy tails on peacocks, or the mane on a lion, or the bright colors on some animals. These typically tend to be males with these features. Females are attracted to maybe certain features in males, right? And those males that possess those features, they get lucky more often, right? They're going to have more babies because the females are attracted to those things. That tail isn't all that good for getting away from a lion chasing you or a tiger chasing you, right? But it's good for attracting a mate. So they reproduce more. So even amongst humans, there are certain characteristics that might make you more desirable, right? And you reproduce more, and those traits get exaggerated in your population. It's hard to track this, but one example they think is maybe both Native Americans and Asians have less thick body hair, and it could be because that has been sexually desirable in their populations and then been kind of selected for sexually, like that. So the other difference, too, is assortative mating. Anybody ever pick up a copy of like the the engagement section of the Sunday paper and I look at it sometimes and think it looks like brothers and sisters are getting married. They look so, people look so much alike the person they're with. And there's some kind of subconscious thing that goes on with this where we tend to be attracted to somebody that's sort of like us in some ways. Sounds a little gross on the surface, doesn't it? But you see this, and within a population, the more you have that going on, right, where you're mating with someone that looks kind of like you, the more those traits get exaggerated and the populations become different from each other. But once again, it's not saying that everybody, all billion people in some so-called race, have those differences, right? The science just doesn't back that up. So that's it for my part, right? Got it done in a reasonable amount of time. We have time for Laurie now, right?
Sure. You better not be drifting, because I've got 15 more minutes with you yet. I would like to share some things and tell you about things. I know some of you have obligations elsewhere, so if you need to, that's absolutely fine. So where I want to take the conversation is around what are the implications when we look at the so-called social dynamic of what we call race, and where it takes us in terms of the area of genetics. Professor Douglas and Hoving shared with you that people have been occupying different places on Earth for a long, long, long time. And that evolution, the geographical locations due to things that you just heard about from Professor Hoving, has allowed our skin tones to find different looks. So if you're in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to have dark skin. If you're in Asia, you're going to have moderately tan skin. You'll have a different eye form. Various things, particularly for this particular discussion is around skin, but you will find that wherever you are, those skin tones can have a story if you go back in time enough to what brought that skin tone to be where it is. The real question is not whether skin color and hair form, etc., are genetic, because they are. They are genetic. You got those skin tones that you have on your body because of the genes that your parents sent and brought down to you. The question that's upon us then is, does that trait drive itself into making us have to look deeper into other traits that one can have? And does that have implications for the medical world, if you will? Well, folks, what happened about 70 years ago, as was mentioned by Professor Hoving, is that we took in earnest a snapshot. Anthropologists and geneticists around the world started drawing people's blood. And they drew their blood, and what they wanted to do was start looking at the genes that comprise the human condition. What makes us up inside? And as we continue to look at that, looking for any measurable difference in our genetic variation, we found there wasn't any. 99.9% of the genetics in this room is identical with each other. Okay? And so what does that tell us then? It is a visual difference. It's one that we quickly look at. So often don't we find anything that we do. It's differences, differences, differences. I'm old, so I remember a song called From Sesame Street. And it said, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. You guys remember that one? Okay? And so we're told since we're little we got to look at differences. But the reality is the genetics say, not so fast, not so fast. Let's not look at those differences. So one of the things is that I want to throw a big word out at you, and that is that genes are in our bodies what are called non-concordant. It's a big fancy name that just says the genes that we have don't necessarily have to all be talking to each other and presented together in one package. What that means, folks, is that you can have isolated genes that are creating expressions upon us, and our phenotype being one of them, our look externally, but they're not linked. Your eye color doesn't decide what your height will be. The size of your hand is not going to determine if that makes you better at athletics. Okay? So they are not linked genes. They're not necessarily genes that run in packages that we would sort and say, this race has this package of genes that drive who they are. It doesn't work that way. We have some genes that have expressed themselves and have had benefits because of the environment people live in, but they're really not packaged in that way that we tend to want to think is happening. where I want to take it for the few minutes that we've got, and we're going to have to be a little bit pressed for time here, so I'll go fast through this. Let me see. Oops. And I just moved into something I didn't want to do. But I want to talk about medicine for a few minutes because I'm nervous about what we're seeing happen in the realm of medical treatments and clinical care for the humankind. Wouldn't it be nice on a checklist, on the census, we could just say, what are you? And we could just check off human. Now, it doesn't mean to minimize that we need to be honoring that there has been huge issues that have played out. But when we talk about genetics, we are human, okay? Well, here's a quick snapshot. Do you know who the guy on the left is? Okay, you know him, right? Okay, famous research, okay, and proposed, Albert Einstein, right? Well, even Albert Einstein had to admit that he made a mistake. And he made a mistake when it came to a theory on relativity. And in short, I won't expand on that because that's not the purpose of this talk. But there was a guy named Hubble. What do you guys know about Hubble? What was Hubble? Telescopes, right? So all of a sudden, Hubble came up with some new research and evidence that said the universe is expanding. And all of a sudden, Einstein's like, oh my gosh, I'm totally wrong. I completely took us on a wrong path. And he admitted it. He said it was the biggest blunder of his life. And he retracted and he pulled back on it. What I would propose to you folks is that in the realm of medicine, I'm afraid we're making potentially some big blunders. And here's why. When you look at, where'd it go? When you look at diseases in the United States, the leading causes of disease, actually mortality, have been identified. So the interesting correlation is that the African American population suffers more than anyone. In 22 of the 24 diseases, African American population suffer a higher occurrence than anyone else. So very quickly, we could be led to suggest then, well, that must mean they have genes that are different than the people who aren't getting it. Well, let's just do some logic here. In 22 diseases, the only population, the African American population, are the only ones who are getting these diseases. So could have all the mutations that make diseases happen, all those mutations only happen to one particular group of people on the earth? It doesn't seem logical. Of the 24 causes of death in America, certainly there has to be some where African Americans lead, some where European Americans lead, and some where Asian Americans have prevalence. But we don't see that. So what it tells me, and hopefully as you ponder this a little bit, it suggests that we are putting a label that this disease is caused by something inside their bodies, when in fact it actually might be a superimposed environmental triggers that are causing this, things that are outside the realm of genetics that make these disparities, that make this sad situation that plays out in a population of humankind. Well, this story got very brought to the surface with a man, I won't belabor him, but his name is Leroy. He was a famous evolutionary geneticist and evolutionary biologist. And he put a stake in the ground and he said that races do indeed exist. Here's a famous evolutionary biologist who put a stamp on it. He went down a path. Think of Einstein again. I'm not saying he's completely wrong, but a lot of the science to date, a lot of current research is saying, it's just not adding up. But what he did opened up Pandora's box. It opened up a floodgate of people saying, if races exist, then medical treatment for races should be now a focus for us. And that's indeed what took off. It was published in the New York Times, and it really gave the invitation for pharmaceutical industries to say, we've got ourselves a market, okay? And so let's talk about a few of them, okay? We don't have time to do them all, but I'll talk about a few of them. There is a major pharmaceutical manufacturer called VaxGen. Many of the vaccines that you have taken or have given your children, have been produced by them. Well, VaxGen was on this major quest to try to find a vaccine for HIV, okay? And they studied 5,300 people. That's a pretty sizable lot of individuals in a study, volunteers. In that study that was done, 5% of the people who took the vaccine developed HIV. But interestingly, 5.3% of the people who took a placebo developed HIV. You guys know what a placebo is, right? Okay, a fake. So what happened is that really was really bad. There was nothing supporting to make that study conclusive enough to actually move it forward. So all of a sudden, Vaxgen's now they've invested millions of dollars now into this product, into this line of research. So they pulled back, and they said, you know what? Let's look at a different angle now, because we just got the endorsement from science that said race exists. So here, could we take another snapshot? 314 African Americans in the study were present. Okay, 13 developed HIV. So they shifted the statistical switch, if you will, and they said, well, that meant 78% of African Americans didn't get HIV. 78% of them were protected. So all of a sudden, they were trying to put it out on the market, a new spin that says, okay, this drug really will work for that market. Well, guys, that's really bad science. To have 314 people in a study is not statistically significant. It sent up in the scientific community major flares that said, wait a minute. But that news got pushed out to the media. And I guess I'm putting a bit of a tone against a lot of the media work, because when it did, all of a sudden, this became a big, rose to the surface as a possibility, a drug for a race. And it didn't stop there. Okay? Osteoporosis. We do know in the American population, Asian American women have a greater occurrence of osteoporosis. We could, if we had time, go back in time to look at that a little bit more and examine where and why. But osteoporosis, the manufacturer of a drug called Fosamax, started to spin it that this was really the target audience market that they wanted to use. They wanted to market this to Asian American women. Now, guys, something's wrong with that picture, because the very drug is not that they're doing something different in the body of Asian American women. It's just that this became a big way to pitch it, so that all these physicians treating and caring for women said this really will be serve the market, serve the people well, when in fact that drug could be applied to any women with equal success and equal value. That is not a good thing, but we have spun it that way because we were given license to do that. People said, oh, races exist. But all the genetics says no. Heart disease, this was a big one. And I know I'm going to watch my clock. I've got so many I can share with you, but this one was amazing. There is the reality when you look at heart disease that there is definite disparities. Let me show you some examples. So this is heart disease in America, where it occurs, prevalence by county, frequency, in number of deaths per 100,000. Okay, so you can see kind of a distribution map that shows that. Let's lay this one right on top of it. And this is the percentage of the country's population that are African American. So it seems, and again, my students, causation, correlation, those distinctions in those two words. Let's go back to that again. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Oh no, where'd I go? I was afraid of using someone else's advancer. I was not going to follow my line of thinking. So if you go back to this one, and you superimpose this one on it, this manufacturer of Bidil, which was a drug that actually was a merger of two drugs. These two drugs had been on the market for a long time. They merged them, tweaked them, modified them, and they first put this drug out on the market, and you know what? It didn't have any significant conclusive evidence that people should use it. So the Food and Drug Administration said, no, in a vote 9-3, they said you cannot put this drug out on the market, at least with the evidence that you currently have. Well, Bidil retreated, went back to the drawing board and said, but look at the statistics, the data that shows that African American people are faced with cardiovascular disease in a much greater frequency than those that aren't. Please, FDA, let us go back and study this one more time. But we're going to just study the black population in America. Why would they want to do this? Money talks. Because what happens, as soon as they were given license by the FDA to go back and find new research lines, they could extend their patent for the clock starts as soon as they are told that they can begin this line of research. They would have a patent on that drug for 20 years. When Bidil, and you guys, Bidil is on the market, okay? And Bidil is a drug that is used. It doesn't mean that Bidil only works in people of color. The study just happened to use it that way because the Food and Drug Administration said, okay, put it out there. So what it did was it created a huge, huge cascade of events. This opened up the door for people, for pharmaceutical after pharmaceutical after pharmaceutical to go back, retreat, and say, we're going to spin new studies that make it look like it's a race drug, when in fact they really are not. But they're done for money. In fact, Bidil, do you know how much money they made? $66 million on the first year that it was put out. Okay? But they did it now under the auspices that it is a drug for Black Americans, for Black people, when in fact it doesn't, the study didn't look to see, is there a difference between Black and white and Eurasian people in terms of how well their bodies respond to the drug? Really, really bad science, but sadly accepted practice. Well, my goodness, we have so many more to go through. I guess in short, I just want to, let me just do a quick flash, Sarah, and I won't elaborate on these, but I want you to draw attention to the disparities that are out there. We think Native American people have a greater occurrence of, we know they do. They have double the occurrence of diabetes than the regular population does. Does that mean they have a gene for it? Not at all. We can do all kinds of environmental studies to show some of the things that are leading people to have a propensity to obesity, which brings on age-onset diabetes. There are many. Tim talked about, let's do this one, sickle cell anemia earlier today. So you've got malaria in yellow on the world. You've got the sickle cell gene shown in red on the globe. But it's not just Africa. It's the lower Mediterranean, Arabia, India, and you find that this sickle cell gives people of those areas where their malaria is at greater risk that ability to survive it and to be resistant to the infection. We talked about blood type earlier. I thought you might find this interesting. Look at these statistics. Look at where blood type is in the world. For years, about 30 years ago, they thought once we could start typing people's blood, we could put people in groups by their race, by blood. I remember teachers telling me that certain races have certain types of blood more prevalent. When you look at this, it doesn't even make sense to hold to that notion. It is actually a celebration of the variation of the humankind across the globe. Australian Aborigines and Native Americans have the same blood type shared. They've never been by each other. The Blackfoot Indians of Montana and parts of Australia share the same blood type prevalence. So I'm trying to bring home to you, I guess, as time allows here, that there are just so many stories after stories where our disease states are being thought of as racial, as race constructs, when in fact the biology says no, okay? It's speculation, it's poor science, it is business, and it is irresponsibility in terms of those people who push this out to the general audience, to the general lay people. And we buy into it because we're trusting our media, we're trusting our doctors, we're trusting science to have a good handle on it. In fact, they don't. Why you're here today is probably the most critical, paramount thing. We are merging this discussion of social science and biological science, putting these two together, and making accountability on all research ends, be it historical, be it social, be it biological. And then calling on our media and calling on our journalists to give true reporting ethical due diligence, okay? Talking about what's the financial gain. When pharmaceuticals want to put a new spiel on a new drug because they can make millions of dollars on it under the new auspices, I'm worried for the future to imagine where some of our diseases can go, that we will tailor make them to the point that people have a misconception entirely about it. Well, I guess in short, as we wrap it up here, the world cannot be divided. What our walkways we hope for you are today is that the world's people cannot be divided biologically along a racial line. We're just too young. We just haven't been separated enough, and we're so mobile that we probably never will. We don't geographically isolate ourselves from each other. We need to strive to have more individualized medicine. It's not to say that we can't once we know the human genome, but we should be tailoring your medicine for you as an individual, not as a race, for you, okay? Finally, my quote, and then we're going to move it to Sarah, but I thought this was just a very interesting place, that racial profiling has no place anywhere, and for certain it shouldn't be in medicine. So my particular one side of the angle here. All right, we have one last thing for you to do, though.
We have to do one last thing. We have to find out your answers from the introductory activity, right? Did you guys take a look in your answer keys? And I need to make sure that you transferred the knowledge, right? We started with the introductory activity. What is the answer? How confident were you in your choices at first? Was it pretty difficult? Did anybody get them all right? Did you check your answer keys? Raise your hand if you still need an answer key. For those of you who walked in a little bit later, I really want 1 more minute of your time. I'll just take 1 minute, okay? We looked at these characteristics as groups, and we tried to place people into these categories. These are real people who place themselves into a category in a census. And when we looked at them, what did we look at? What did you as a group decide? Skin color. Did you look at anything else? Hair texture. So you looked at a few superficial characteristics, and you made a decision, right? So we want to talk about, and did anybody get them all right? We want to talk about that skin color is only skin deep, right? We discussed that these physical traits, they're non-concordant. They're not linked. They're individual traits. That's what Professor Foster told us. And Professor Hoving told us that the reason why you have those traits are because of where your ancestors are from and what was beneficial through natural selection. And Professor Douglas told us that we are all one race, that there is not a subspecies of race. There's not a subspecies of humans, right? Because we've moved around and we all came from the same ancestry. So this doesn't say, it does say that race has no genetic basis, but it doesn't say, and it says that human subspecies don't exist. But we want to talk about that race is not biological. Of course, there is social constraints, there's cultural constraints, that's where race comes from. But biologically speaking, you cannot look at someone to decide where they fit in. Okay? So I really hope that you enjoyed our speech today. We tried to really do the activity to get your mind wrapped around where you're coming from, and hope we had enough time to close it to pull everybody together so we know where we're going.
Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks. And if you can leave the packets right at your seats, I'll come around and pick them up.
You guys, you have the evaluation sheets that were handed out during the lecture.